Moore is sure to touch your heart deeply. So, relax for a moment, stay quiet, and listen carefully. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're listening from. Your participation is what helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's begin. Georgia, 1862. For over a year, the war had been raging when Lydia Moore first understood that her hands could create miracles her life would never allow her to claim. She was 10 years old, barefoot, her undernourished frame draped in a dress made from flour sacks. From when she was old enough to carry a sack, her fingers had grown calloused from picking cotton. Already, her back was developing the permanent curve that marked her people, her eyes holding shadows no child should carry. Isolated in the red clay hills of central Georgia sat Magnolia Creek Plantation, far enough from the war's main theaters that life continued in its brutal routine despite the distant thunder of cannons. For 3 generations, the plantation had belonged to the Vance family, passed down through careful marriages and ruthless business practices that accumulated land and human property in equal measure. The previous winter, Master Harold Vance had died, leaving the estate to his widow, Eleanora, and their adult son, Marcus, who promptly enlisted in the Confederate cavalry and rode off to defend Southern honor. He left his mother to manage 300 acres and 47 enslaved people with only an aging overseer and her own bitter determination. Consumed by disappointments that had curdled into a vinegar sourness was Eleanora Vance, 42 years old. Everything she touched was poisoned by it. People said she had been pretty once, but years of Georgia sun and unfulfilled ambitions had hardened her features into something sharp and unforgiving. In her youth, she had fancied herself an artist, taking lessons from an itinerant portrait painter who had passed through Savannah. She had filled sketchbooks with competent but uninspired drawings of flowers and buildings and the occasional stiff portrait. Of recognition, she had dreamed, of her work hanging in parlors and galleries, of being known as more than just another plantation wife. But her work was mediocre, and she knew it, which made the knowing worse than ignorance would have been. Technically adequate but soulless were her paintings, the kind of art that provoked polite compliments and was then forgotten the moment the viewer turned away. Partly because he had praised her watercolors effusively, she had married Harold Vance, though she suspected even then that he was praising her dowry rather than her talent. After marriage, she had continued painting sporadically, but motherhood and plantation management consumed her time, and her lack of genuine gift consumed her enthusiasm. By the time Harold died, Eleanora's easel had been gathering dust for 5 years, a monument to dreams that had withered on the vine. To Magnolia Creek, Lydia Moore belonged the way the cotton plants and the red clay soil belonged to it, which is to say, she was considered property rather than person, asset rather than human, a thing that could be bought and sold and worked and discarded according to the needs and whims of those who owned the land. Her mother, Ruth, was the plantation seamstress, skilled with needle and thread, tasked with making and mending clothes for both the enslaved community and, occasionally, for the Vance family when Eleanora didn't want to pay town prices. When Lydia was 3 years old, her father had been sold away, traded for a breeding mare and some cash to settle a gambling debt. Barely, she remembered him except as a feeling of safety that had disappeared one morning and never returned. In the desperate way enslaved mothers raised children, Ruth had raised her daughter, trying to keep her safe while knowing that safety was an illusion that could shatter any moment the white folks decided otherwise. She taught Lydia to be invisible, to keep her eyes down, to speak only when spoken to endure without complaint because complaint meant the whip or worse. She taught her the songs that carried coded messages of resistance and hope, taught her about the drinking good in the sky that pointed north toward freedom, taught her to believe that somehow, someday, things might be different, even though neither of them could imagine how. What Ruth couldn't teach, couldn't control, couldn't suppress was the gift that had manifested in Lydia's hands almost as soon as she could hold a stick. Constantly and compulsively, the child drew with whatever material she could find. In the dust of the cabin floor using her finger, she drew, creating images so precise and detailed that other enslaved people would stop their work to stare. On the walls of the cotton barn, using charcoal from the fire, she drew, sketching the mules and chickens and other slaves with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone so young who had never received a moment of formal instruction. blackberry juice she collected in a stolen tin cup and used as paint, applying it to scraps of cloth with a brush made from her own hair tied to a stick. With an intensity that made her seem absent from her own body, she would study a face or a tree or a bird, her eyes cataloguing every detail, her mind somehow translating what she saw into marks on surfaces that captured not just the appearance but the essence of her subjects. When she drew her mother's face on a piece of bark using a nail, Ruth had wept because she saw herself truly reflected there, saw her own exhaustion and love and sorrow rendered with a tenderness that transcended the crude materials. As something extraordinary and slightly frightening, the other enslaved people recognized Lydia's gift, a manifestation of power in a powerless person, a flowering of beauty in a place designed to crush all beauty that didn't serve white interests. Old Isaiah, who claimed to remember Africa, though most doubted the truth of that claim, said Lydia carried the spirit of the ancestors, that she had been marked by forces older than slavery, that her hands were instruments of something the white folks couldn't own, no matter how many papers said they owned her body. Proud of her daughter's gift and terrified of it in equal measure was Ruth, because anything that made you special also made you vulnerable, made you visible, made you a target. Because she couldn't not draw, Lydia drew. Because something inside her demanded expression regardless of circumstances, because art was the only language she had for feelings too large and complex for a 10-year-old to articulate otherwise. She drew the cotton fields but gave the plants faces that screamed silently. She drew the plantation house as a beautiful monster, all graceful columns and predatory angles. She drew her own hands covered in invisible chains. She drew freedom as a bird flying toward a sun she'd never seen except in dreams. For months, Lydia's art remained contained within the enslaved quarters, hidden from white eyes, a secret kept by people who understood that anything precious must be protected from those who would steal or destroy it. But on plantations, secrets were fragile things, sustained by collective will but vulnerable to accident and circumstance. The accident came in late summer when Lydia was sent to the main house to help her mother with mending work, carrying a basket of torn linens that needed repair. While her mother worked in the sewing room, Lydia waited in the hallway, bored and restless. A piece of charcoal that had fallen from a scuttle near a fireplace she found, and a relatively clean section of wall hidden behind a tall cabinet she found. In the 15 minutes she was left alone, she drew. Without thinking, she drew, her hands moving automatically, creating the image of a dead bird she had seen that morning lying beneath the magnolia tree, a small brown sparrow with its wings spread and its eyes empty, beautiful and terrible in its absolute stillness. When she moved the cabinet later that afternoon looking for a dropped earring, Eleanora Vance discovered the drawing. Frozen, she stood, staring at the charcoal sketch on her wall, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Magnificent was the drawing, not good or promising or interesting, but magnificent. In a trained adult artist, the technical skill would have been impressive. The emotional resonance, the way the dead bird seemed to embody mortality itself, was the work of someone with a profound and mature understanding of beauty and loss. That someone had snuck into her house and created this drawing as some kind of prank or message was Eleanora's first thought. Her second thought, when she noticed charcoal smudges on the floor leading back toward the sewing room, was that perhaps her seamstress, Ruth, had hidden artistic talent. Her third thought, when she stormed into the sewing room and saw 10-year-old Lydia with charcoal dust still on her small fingers, was the thought that would seal the child's fate: this slave girl could paint, and Eleanora Vance could claim those paintings as her own. With the force of revelation, the realization hit Eleanora. Here was the answer to all her disappointments, the solution to all her failed ambitions. She didn't need to develop talent she didn't possess, she just needed to control access to talent that already existed. Who would question her? Who would believe that a slave child, an illiterate piece of property, could create art that rivaled the master's? The very absurdity of the truth would make the lie unassailable. Ruth she sent away on an errand, and the sewing room door she closed. She sat down across from Lydia, studying the child with new eyes, seeing not a human being but a resource to be exploited, a tool to be used, a secret to be kept. In a deceptively gentle voice, she asked Lydia if the child had made the drawing on the wall. Terrified of punishment, Lydia tried to deny it. But Eleanora had seen the charcoal on her fingers, had seen the way the child's eyes had flickered with recognition. For drawing on the wall, Eleanora didn't punish Lydia. Instead, she did something far more cruel. She smiled, a cold stretching of lips that never reached her eyes, and told Lydia that she had a special gift, that she was going to have a special job now, that she was very lucky because not every slave got to work in the big house. She told Lydia she would be moving into the basement of the main house, into a room that would be set up just for her, where she would make beautiful pictures that would help the plantation and help her people. At first, Lydia didn't understand, she didn't grasp the true nature of what was being proposed. She just knew that something bad was happening, something that made her stomach hurt and her skin feel cold. She asked if her mama could come too, and Eleanora's smile grew sharper as she explained that no, Ruth would stay in the quarters where she belonged, but Lydia would be able to see her mother sometimes if she was good and did what she was told. Then Eleanora explained the rules, and Lydia began to understand the trap that had closed around her. Lydia would paint pictures. Eleanora would sign them and show them and sell them. Nobody would ever know that Lydia had painted them. If Lydia told anyone, if she refused to paint, if she tried to run away or hurt herself or otherwise failed in her duties, then Ruth would be sold to the sugar plantations in Louisiana. In detail, Eleanora described those plantations, her voice pleasant and factual, as she explained how slaves there died within 5 years from the brutal work and disease and heat, how Ruth would spend her last days cutting cane in swamps full of snakes and mosquitoes, how she would die far from anyone who loved her and be buried in an unmarked grave. Lydia was 10 years old. Enough she understood to know she had no choice. She could paint, or her mother would die. That was the bargain, simple and terrible and absolute. That night, from the cabin she shared with her mother to the basement of the main house, Lydia was moved. The basement had been used for storage, a damp stone room with a small window near the ceiling that let in a square of light during the day and nothing at night. Cleared out and furnished it was by Eleanora with an easel, a small table, a pile of canvases, and painting supplies that had belonged to her own abandoned artistic pursuits. A thin mattress on the floor for sleeping, a chamber pot in the corner, and an oil lamp that gave off more smoke than light there was. Also, attached to a bolt in the wall was a chain that could be locked around Lydia's ankle. Almost apologetically, Eleanora explained that the chain was necessary to make sure Lydia didn't wander around the house at night and disturb anyone, as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than the literal shackling of a child. Long enough to let Lydia reach the easel and the table and the mattress and the chamber pot was the chain, but not long enough to reach the door or the window. Long enough to work, not long enough to escape. Alone in the basement that first night, Lydia cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty of everything but fear and grief. She thought about her mother, about the cabin that was small and crowded but filled with love, about the songs and stories and embraces that had made even slavery bearable. She thought about the other children she had played with, about the communal meals and the whispered conversations and the network of care that existed in the quarters despite everything designed to break it. Now she was alone, truly, completely alone in a way she had never been alone before. Cold despite the Georgia heat was the basement, the stone walls seeming to absorb warmth rather than hold it. Absolute was the darkness when Eleanora finally took the lamp away, thick and suffocating, full of sounds Lydia couldn't identify. On the thin mattress she lay and felt the weight of the chain on her ankle and understood that her life had ended, even though she was still breathing. The next morning, with breakfast, a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of bread, better food than Lydia usually got but still barely adequate, Eleanora returned. A book of paintings, reproductions of famous European works, she also brought and laid it open on the table. To a landscape, a pastoral scene of rolling hills and distant mountains and a river winding through green fields, she pointed and told Lydia to copy it onto a canvas. Never had Lydia painted before. She had drawn with charcoal and improvised with berry juice, but she had never used real paints, never worked with oils and brushes and canvas. The basics Eleanora showed her, how to mix colors on a palette, how to load the brush, how to apply paint in layers. Punctual and impatient was the instruction, less like teaching and more like explaining how to operate a machine. Then Eleanora left Lydia alone with the canvas and the paints and the expectation that genius would manifest on command. For a long time, just at the blank canvas, Lydia stared, at the paints that smelled strange and chemical, at the brushes with their different sizes and shapes. When she finally picked up a brush, her hand shook. Wrong felt the paint, too thick and slippery compared to the charcoal and berry juice she was used to. Tentative and clumsy were her first strokes, creating muddy colors that bore no resemblance to the painting she was supposed to copy. But the gift Lydia had, and about circumstances or materials or the broken heart of the vessel that contained it, the gift didn't care. Within an hour, her hands found their rhythm. Within 2 hours, she had begun to understand how oils behaved differently from her improvised mediums but followed similar principles. Within 3 hours, taking shape on the canvas was the landscape, and it was becoming clear that Lydia could not only copy the painting Eleonora had shown her but could improve upon it, adding depth and emotion that the original lacked. By evening, when Eleonora returned, finished was the painting. For a full minute without speaking, Eleonora stood in front of it, her face cycling through expressions Lydia couldn't read: surprise, satisfaction, something that might have been greed, something else that looked almost like rage. Finally, she told Lydia that the work was acceptable, that tomorrow she would begin a portrait, that Lydia should eat her dinner and sleep because there would be more work ahead. With brutal efficiency, the routine established itself. Every morning, Eleonora brought food and gave Lydia her assignment: a landscape to copy, a portrait to paint from a photograph, a still life composition. Every evening, Eleonora collected the finished work and gave her next instructions. Together blurred the days, distinguished only by which painting Lydia was working on, which colors she was mixing, which techniques she was teaching herself through trial and error. Worse than the work was the isolation. In a liminal space Lydia existed, neither in the house nor in the quarters, neither slave nor artisan, neither child nor adult. A secret she was, a ghost, a tool that produced valuable art and was otherwise irrelevant. Once a week she saw her mother, visits that Eleonora allowed as reward for good work and denied as punishment for any resistance. Of a different kind, those visits were torture: 15 minutes of desperate embracing and whispered assurances, Ruth trying to pretend everything would be all right while her eyes showed she knew it wouldn't, Lydia trying to be brave while her soul screamed for rescue that would never come. Lydia's entire world became the basement. By heart she learned its dimensions: every crack in the stone walls, every variation in the damp smell, every position where the small window let in the most light. By lamplight she learned to paint when Eleonora demanded work done quickly. To ignore the headaches from the oil fumes and the smoke she learned. To function on inadequate food and inadequate sleep and the complete absence of anything resembling joy she learned. Landscapes that would never be her landscape she painted, mountains she would never climb, oceans she would never see. Portraits of white people from photographs Eleonora brought she painted, wealthy planters and their wives and children, people who smiled into the camera with the confidence of those who had never doubted their right to exist. With precision, Lydia captured their likenesses but couldn't help adding something to their eyes: a hint of cruelty in the men, a shadow of complicity in the women, a disturbing emptiness in the children. These subtle rebellions Eleonora never seemed to notice, or if she did, she didn't care because the technical quality was so high that any emotional ambiguity could be dismissed as artistic interpretation. After 3 months, to select visitors Eleonora began showing Lydia's work, claiming the paintings as her own creation. Elaborate stories she told about her artistic awakening after her husband's death, about how grief had unlocked something in her creative spirit, about how she painted in frenzies of inspiration that left her exhausted but fulfilled. Her they believed because they had no reason not to, because the paintings existed and Eleonora possessed them, and the alternative explanation was unthinkable. One of the landscapes a Charleston art dealer saw and offered to show Eleonora's work in his gallery. Eleonora accepted, and within weeks, paintings that Lydia had created in a basement prison were being sold to wealthy Confederates for prices that made Eleonora's eyes gleam with satisfaction. The money-funded uniforms and supplies for Confederate soldiers supported the very system that kept Lydia in chains, transformed her gift into fuel for the machinery of her own oppression. More demanding became Eleonora. More paintings she wanted, faster production, higher quality. Increasingly complex assignments she brought Lydia, testing the limits of her abilities. Also paranoid she became about the secret being discovered, about Lydia somehow communicating the truth to someone who might believe it. Less frequent became the visits with Ruth, then stopped altogether. Reassigned to fieldwork, Eleonora said Ruth had been, that she was too busy to visit, but Lydia suspected Eleonora was simply cutting off her last remaining connection to humanity. Into something beyond loneliness deepened the isolation. Herself disappearing, Lydia began to feel, her sense of self eroding under the relentless pressure of being nothing but hands that painted, nothing but a tool that created art for others to claim. At night she stopped dreaming, or if she dreamed, she didn't remember. About escape or rescue or any future beyond the next painting she stopped thinking. In an eternal present of mixing colors and applying brushstrokes and creating beauty that meant nothing to her because it was stolen the moment it was finished, she existed. 6 months into her imprisonment, as winter settled over Georgia and the basement grew so cold that Lydia's fingers sometimes went numb while she painted, a new demand Eleonora made that crossed a line Lydia hadn't known still existed. A description and rough sketches of a scene she wanted painted she brought, enslaved people working in a cotton field, but happy about it, smiling, singing, content in their bondage, the kind of propaganda painting that justified slavery by portraying it as a benevolent institution where Negroes were protected and provided for and naturally suited to their station. That a prominent Confederate official was commissioning the painting, Eleonora explained, that it would hang in a government building in Richmond, that it would help the Southern cause by showing the world the truth about the peculiar institution. The word truth she said without irony, without any acknowledgement that she was demanding Lydia use her gift to create a lie, to betray her people, to paint chains as if they were flower garlands. Refused Lydia. It was the first time she had refused anything since her imprisonment began. She said she wouldn't paint it, couldn't paint it, that Eleonora could beat her or starve her or sell her mother, but she would not use her hands to create that particular obscenity. Stronger than she felt came out the words, fueled by rage that had been building for months, rage at Eleonora and the world and God and herself for being powerless. Measured and terrible was Eleonora's response. She didn't shout or hit Lydia. She simply left the basement, locked the door, and didn't return for 3 days. No food, no water, no light except the small window that showed day turning to night turning to day. By licking condensation from the stone walls and trying to ignore the hunger that consumed her from the inside, Lydia survived. She survived, but barely. And when Eleonora finally returned with food and water and that cold smile, Lydia understood that she would paint the propaganda piece because the alternative was death. With smiles on their faces, she painted enslaved people picking cotton. A sun that looked warm and gentle instead of brutal and punishing she painted. An overseer who looked paternal rather than threatening she painted. A lie so convincing she painted that people who saw it would nod and feel comfortable in their prejudices, would point to the painting as proof that slavery was natural and right and even kind. While she painted, Lydia cried. Onto her palette fell the tears and mixed with the colors, diluting them, and she had to keep adding more paint to compensate. She cried and painted, creating a masterpiece of propaganda that would outlive her and carry its poison into the future. When it was finished, effusively Eleonora praised the work, called it Lydia's best painting yet, seemed genuinely pleased with both the technical quality and the subject matter. Something break inside her Lydia felt that night, not her will to survive, because that was too deep an animal to break, but something else, something harder to name. Her sense that she was still human, maybe, still someone rather than something. On her thin mattress she lay and stared at the darkness and felt herself becoming hollow, felt her spirit being excavated by forces she couldn't fight, felt the gift that had once been joy becoming an instrument of torture. Deepened the winter, and Lydia's health declined. The damp cold of the basement, the inadequate food, the toxic fumes from the oil paints, the absolute lack of sunlight and fresh air, all of it accumulated in her small body like poison. A cough that wouldn't leave she developed, weight she couldn't afford to lose she lost, in a fog of exhaustion that made thinking difficult she moved through her days. But still she painted because stopping meant consequences she couldn't bear, because her mother's life still hung in the balance, because the machine that had claimed her wouldn't release her until it had consumed everything she had to give. In terms of how it might affect productivity, Eleonora noticed the decline only. Better food she brought occasionally, a thin blanket to Lydia's sleeping arrangement she added, a small stove she installed that did little to combat the pervasive cold. Purely practical were these improvements, investments in maintaining a valuable tool, containing no trace of compassion or recognition of Lydia's humanity. Outside arrived spring, bringing warmth and new life to a world Lydia could only glimpse through her small window, and her second year of imprisonment began. 11 she was now, though birthdays meant nothing in the basement, where time was measured only in paintings completed and days survived. Considerably had Eleanora's reputation as an artist grown. She was invited to show work in Atlanta and Savannah, received commissions from wealthy families across Georgia and South Carolina, was written about in newspapers as a bright light in Southern culture, a reminder that civilization flourished even during wartime. To Lydia belonged every word of praise. Every painting hanging in parlors and galleries and government buildings had been created by her hands, had been torn from her soul, had cost her pieces of herself that would never be recovered. So vast was the injustice that Lydia couldn't hold it all in her mind at once. In fragments she could only feel it, glimpses of rage and sorrow that flared up and then had to be suppressed because rage and sorrow didn't mix colors or apply brushstrokes. In late spring, yet her most prestigious commission, Eleanora received a series of 6 paintings depicting Southern life and virtue intended as gifts for Confederate generals. Large, complex, ambitious would the paintings be. In a way Lydia had never seen before, Eleanora was excited, already planning how the commission would cement her reputation, how she would be remembered as one of the great artists of the Confederacy. To Lydia in detail she explained the requirements: 2 landscapes showing the beauty of Southern land, 2 portraits of idealized Southern families, and 2 genre paintings showing daily life on plantations, the same propaganda as before but more sophisticated, more subtle, designed to appeal to educated tastes. Reference materials Eleanora brought: photographs, sketches, descriptions, and a deadline of 3 months to complete all 6 works she gave Lydia. Too much it was, even for someone with Lydia's gift. 6 major paintings in 3 months would have been challenging under ideal circumstances. In the basement, working with inadequate light and declining health, it was nearly impossible. But impossible didn't matter because refusal meant consequences that Lydia had learned not to risk. So the work she began, painting for 12 and 14 hours a day, falling asleep at the easel, sometimes waking with brush marks on her face and stiffness in every muscle. Slowly emerged the paintings, each one taking pieces of Lydia that she didn't have to spare. Plantation houses that looked like palaces instead of prisons she painted. White children playing while enslaved children watched from the background, smiling as if they enjoyed their exclusion, she painted. Masters and mistresses who looked wise and benevolent she painted. A world that had never existed except in the fantasies of people who needed to believe their cruelty was kindness she painted. And with each painting, a little more Lydia disappeared. The cough that had troubled her through winter became constant, racking her small frame, sometimes bringing up blood. Her hands developed tremors that made fine detail work difficult. Her eyes, strained from years of close work in poor light, began to blur and ache. Slowly but certainly she was dying, consumed by the gift that Eleanora was harvesting like cotton from a field. 2 months into the commission, on the final painting Lydia began working, a landscape that was supposed to show a cotton field at sunset, all golden light and pastoral beauty. Extensive notes about what she wanted Eleanora had provided: the composition, the lighting, the mood. But when at the blank canvas Lydia looked, something shifted inside her. A spark of rebellion, a flash of the self she had been before the basement, a refusal to completely disappear without leaving some mark of truth. As Eleanora had specified, she painted the landscape, creating the sunset and the cotton field and the distant trees. But in the foreground shadows, where casual viewers might not look closely, where the painting would only reveal itself to those who truly examined it, Lydia painted herself. A self-portrait hidden in darkness, it was her own face emerging from the shadows with eyes that stared directly at the viewer. Her exhaustion, her sorrow, her rage, her humanity she painted. As witness and victim, as creator and prisoner, as the truth hiding beneath the lie, she painted herself. And she knew that Eleanora wouldn't notice, wouldn't understand the significance even if she did notice, wouldn't recognize that Lydia had created a secret message in the language of art that might someday be understood by someone with eyes to see. In early August, the painting was finished. Carefully packed were the 6 works and sent to their destination, and with satisfaction at completing such a prestigious commission, Eleanora glowed. On her mattress Lydia lay and coughed blood into a rag and felt death approaching like a slow tide, inevitable and almost welcome. 12 years old she was, an art that would survive for generations she had created, art that people would admire and study, art that carried her soul in every brushstroke. But nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever see her name beside her work. Nobody would know that she had existed, had suffered, had given everything she had to give, and then been asked for more. In the basement darkness, Lydia Moore closed her eyes and wondered if disappearing completely might be a kind of freedom. With cooler temperatures that provided no relief to the damp chill of the basement, autumn arrived. Lydia's 12th year was marked by a deterioration so gradual that she barely noticed herself fading, like a painting left too long in direct sunlight, the colors leaching away imperceptibly until one day you looked and realized the image was half gone. Her constant companion had become the cough, a rattling presence in her chest that grew worse at night, keeping her from the sleep her exhausted body desperately needed. Her fingers, which had once moved across canvas with fluid confidence, now trembled and stiffened, requiring willpower to control each stroke. Because it affected the quality and speed of production, Eleanora noticed the decline. Extraordinary still were the paintings. Lydia's gift was too fundamental to be completely eroded by illness, but longer they took to complete, and occasionally Eleanora would find mistakes that needed correction, small imperfections that the old Lydia would never have made. In ways that Lydia's suffering did not, these imperfections enraged Eleanora, because imperfections threatened the illusion of Eleanora's genius, threatened the reputation she had built on stolen talent. More frequent and more creative became the punishments. For days at a time, Eleanora withheld food, reasoning that hunger would sharpen Lydia's focus. During cold nights, she removed the thin blanket, believing that discomfort would motivate faster work. A bell in the basement she installed that she would ring at random hours, disrupting what little sleep Lydia managed to get, keeping her in a state of constant exhaustion that made resistance impossible and obedience automatic. But the cruelest punishment was the complete severing of contact with Ruth. For months Lydia hadn't seen her mother, hadn't heard her voice, hadn't felt her embrace. Still on the plantation, still alive and well, still safe as long as Lydia continued producing paintings, Eleanora claimed Ruth was. But no way to verify these claims had Lydia. For all she knew, already been sold or had died or had simply given up and let grief consume her had her mother. Its own form of torture was the uncertainty, a constant anxiety that gnawed at Lydia's mind while her body weakened. In late September, from a prominent collector in Savannah who had purchased 3 of Eleanora's paintings and wanted to commission a major work, a large-scale historical painting depicting the founding of Georgia, complete with multiple figures and elaborate detail, Eleanora received a letter. With a substantial payment and the promise of prominent display in a new museum being established to celebrate Confederate history and Southern heritage came the commission. Immediately Eleanora accepted, seeing the commission as the pinnacle of her fraudulent career, the work that would cement her legacy as one of the South's great artists. To Lydia, with barely contained excitement, she brought the commission details, laying out sketches and descriptions and historical references across the work table. 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall would the painting need to be, would need to include at least 20 figures in period costume, would need to show ships and buildings and landscape, would need to tell a story of colonial glory and manifest destiny. The most ambitious project Eleanora had ever demanded it was, and 4 months to complete it she gave Lydia. At the blank canvas that had been specially prepared for the commission, Lydia looked, at the mountain of preparatory work that would be required, at Eleanora's gleaming eyes that saw only opportunity and reputation and money, never the dying child who would have to create this masterpiece while chained in a basement. Something inside Lydia, some last reserve of will that had sustained her through 2.5 years of imprisonment, simply gave up. She told Eleanora she couldn't do it, that she was too sick, that her hands didn't work right anymore, that the painting was beyond her capacity. From excitement to fury in an instant transformed Eleanora's face. Lydia's chin she grabbed with one hand, her fingers digging painfully into the child's hollow cheeks, forcing Lydia to meet her eyes. She said that Lydia would complete the painting because the alternative was unthinkable, because Ruth's life still hung in the balance, because Lydia existed for no purpose except to create art that Eleanora could claim. She said that if Lydia failed, if she refused, if she died before completing the commission, then Eleanora would make sure Ruth suffered for her daughter's defiance, would make sure the punishment was creative and prolonged and absolutely devastating. Because it always worked, because Eleanora had identified the one leverage that could control Lydia no matter how broken she became, the threat worked. Her submission. Lydia nodded, and Eleanora released her chin, leaving fingerprint bruises that would fade long before the emotional damage did. In a swirl of skirts and satisfaction, Eleanora left the basement, and to face the enormous blank canvas that would consume the last of her strength and probably her life, Lydia turned. The next day she began the preparatory work, creating detailed sketches that mapped out the composition, determined the placement of figures, established the perspective and lighting. Even in her weakened state, even with trembling hands and blurred vision, intact remained Lydia's fundamental understanding of art. Instinctively she knew how to balance the composition, how to guide the viewer's eye, how to create depth and movement and narrative within a static image. Still there was the gift that had been her curse, still functioning, still producing miracles even as the vessel that contained it crumbled. In early October began the actual painting, and quickly it became a form of prolonged dying. From dawn until her lamp ran out of oil each night Lydia worked, standing at the easel until her legs gave out and she had to work sitting down, mixing colors until her fingers bled from the cold and the chemicals, applying paint with brushes that grew heavier with each passing day. Slowly took shape the historical scene, ships arriving in harbor, colonists establishing their settlement, Native Americans watching from the tree line, all of it rendered with meticulous attention to period detail and historical accuracy. Extensive research materials Eleanora had provided, but her own touches Lydia added, small elements that transformed the painting from mere illustration into something more complex and troubling. Determination but also greed showed the colonists' faces, hunger for land and power barely concealed beneath civilized veneers. Knowledge of what was coming held the Native Americans' expressions, a prescient sorrow that made their static poses dynamic with unspoken tragedy. Beautiful but ominous was the sky Lydia painted, suggesting that the founding moment being celebrated contained the seeds of future violence and injustice. None of these subtleties were conscious choices. For conscious artistry, Lydia was too exhausted. Simply what her hands knew to paint, what her gift demanded, she painted. And through despite Eleanora's specifications and despite the propaganda purpose the painting was meant to serve, bled the truth. A way of asserting itself in Lydia's work had truth, showing up in shadows and expressions and compositional choices that revealed more than surface appearances suggested. By November, half-finished was the painting, and dying was Lydia. No longer any question about it there was. No way to pretend that illness was temporary or that youth and resilience would pull her through. Beyond its limits for too long had her body been pushed. Too much sunlight, fresh air, adequate nutrition, human connection, hope had it been deprived of. The banzo that consumed enslaved people who lost the will to live had taken root in Lydia's spirit, and it was finishing what malnutrition and toxic fumes and physical exhaustion had started. Constantly now she coughed, great racking spasms that left her gasping and weak, that brought up blood in quantities that frightened even her. Completely had her appetite disappeared. Like ash-tasted food and heavy in her stomach it sat, and most days only because Eleanora forced her to she ate, standing over her and threatening consequences until Lydia choked down enough to sustain another day of work. So dramatically had her weight dropped that the chain around her ankle kept slipping off, requiring Eleanora to have it tightened, an adjustment that left raw sores where the metal rubbed against skin stretched tight over bone. Failing too was her vision, not just from the strain of close work in poor light, but from some deeper deterioration that made the world appear increasingly dim and blurred. Closer and closer to the canvas she had to work to see details. By feel as much as by sight she had to mix colors. Muscle memory and instinct she had to trust to compensate for eyes that no longer reliably reported what they saw. Some days, even though the lamp burned steadily, around her the basement seemed to darken, as if her consciousness itself was flickering and fading, preparing for extinction. All of this Eleanora saw, and only to the extent that it threatened the commission's completion she cared. Once she brought a doctor to examine Lydia, a nervous man who took one look at the chained child in the basement and clearly wanted no part of whatever moral compromise he was being asked to participate in. Lydia's chest,